I have very exciting news. I'll show them off again. My partner made brownies. And so I'm going to eat them on the show. Also some tea. Sorry, it's a bit wet. Just balance that gently. I've risked doing this outside again. As you will have known if you watched last week's episode, we had a bit of a deluge and got a bit wet, which was unideal. So the forecast is dubious for the next hour. So I thought I'd risk it again. Some extreme live streaming. Just gonna wait another 2 minutes to wait for people to tag on. Praying for no rain is correct, Umber. But my flatmates are out walking, so hopefully they don't get rained on as well. It was beautiful earlier today. I quite like the rain. Try this, but I have my jersey in case it gets very cold. They are very good. They're all gooey inside. She crushed up some Tim Tams, some caramel Tim Tams, and poured them on top. It was delicious. Just gonna wait one more minute. Okay, I think that is an excellent time to start. So today we're going to be talking about how to judge. Judging is a very, very, very useful skill, both because it's just another huge aspect of debating. So judging can be quite fun. It can be quite challenging. You meet cool people, you engage in cool ideas. Many of the same things that attract you to just ordinary debating, I think also apply to judging. But equally, it makes you a much better speaker. Being able to think about how arguments interact, to be able to explain those to teams, to think about feedback and improvement. These are all distinct skills from being able to give a good speech. But when you apply them reflexively, when you start being exposed to different debaters with different styles that are more or less effective, I think it gives you a lot more to push against in terms of making yourself a good speaker. So judging is excellent. Lots of fun, good in itself, and makes you a better speaker. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do, just once again, chatting about news, talking about cool stuff that's happening with Auckland debating. Secondly, we're going to just go over some judging theory, how should you approach judging? And then the last thing we'll do, which I think is going to be quite cool, is I'm going to share my screen with you and explain to you how I set up my notes and how I approach the more practical side of being an adjudicator. Because often when you are entering with judging for the first time or training for the first time, trying to deal with all of those little things while you're trying to be a good judge can be very difficult. So I want to make you feel prepared practically for when you start training. So what is happening in Auckland DevSoc? Well, obviously last week we had Cinnamon Scroll. That was very exciting. It was an awesome tournament. Lots of people had fun. Grace and I did a lot. In fact, my flat did a lot of judging. There was a moment when all three of us were at the dinner table judging different debates and just being like, thank God we have a good bandwidth to be able to withstand 3 separate debates operating off 3 different laptops. Cinnamon Scroll was excellent. We've got more tournaments coming up, which are exciting. We've got Auckland Novice Tournament, which is very soon. So if you're keen, I think we've still got a few speaker positions for that. So head along to the Auckland debating page. You're actually already on it because you're watching this video. One of our other flatmates, in fact, the only debating flatmate who wasn't involved in Cinnamon Scroll as an AdCore member, is the CA of another cool New Zealand tournament happening called Jurassic IV, where he's just gotten all of his old debating friends to come together to run a tournament for us, the youth of New Zealand debating. And yes, I am relatively old, but I'm still including myself as the youth. And then there's also some cool international tournaments. So the Asia Queer Debating Open is also happening that same weekend. So if you wanted to branch out of New Zealand a little bit, I'd encourage you to either volunteer to judge that if you're feeling comfortable after this amazing seminar, or find a teammate, go along and speak. So those are some of the cool things that are coming up in Auckland DevSoc, but obviously you can follow along just from our Facebook page. So the first thing I'll explain to you when we dive into judging itself is how you become a judge in New Zealand. Because if you have never done a huge amount of debating, the system can seem a little bit opaque, and it's just nice to have a chat through of how that process works. So New Zealand runs a slightly different system to most overseas universities and overseas circuits, in that we run a national setup called accreditation, whereas most other tournaments overseas, and in fact, when New Zealanders go along to things like Australs or go along to things like Worlds, they have to go through the same process. And essentially what happens at international tournaments is sometimes you'll have a judge's test, which is basically like a theory, like theory questions or situational questions that asks you to, from multiple choice, how you would go one way or the other. They use this process to weed out people who are experienced from people who need a little bit more time to develop those core competencies. And then throughout the tournament, you have various people watching you and submitting feedback. And you can move all the way from trainee up to a panelist on a panel with other judges, up to a chair, up to a solo adjudicator, and then obviously they'll break you based on your feedback and based on their opinion as you as a debater. So that whole process happens every tournament. Normally there isn't a huge amount of crossover, so if you're training in one tournament, you're not going to jump to being a chair in another tournament unless the quality of the tournament is massively different. Sometimes that'll happen. You get a lot more experience doing things like paneling or chairing at smaller tournaments than you will if you go straight ahead to Worlds or Australs. But it runs fairly autonomously, often is very like playing it by ear. It's a little bit less formal than the New Zealand system. The New Zealand system is very explicit. We run a national accreditation system. And what that means is you will attend one of a certain few number of tournaments, New Zealand Women's, Throppy, Clayton's, or the 2 major NZUDC tournaments, Easters and Joint Scroll, and you will trainee at that tournament. So unlike international tournaments where you may start as a trainee but very quickly be promoted to a panelist, or you might be a panelist and demoted to trainee, you will be a trainee most likely for that entire tournament. And each round, what will happen is you'll be paired with a good adjudicator, and you'll give your oral adjudication, or if you're not at that stage yet, give an explanation of how you saw the debate to that adjudicator, and then they'll be able to give you feedback. If they think you've given a very good oral adjudication, they may give you the opportunity to give that oral adjudication to the teams in place of a normal adjudication. And they will just add any bits that they think you missed if under the pressure you missed some things out of your adjudication. But normally they give you that opportunity when they're comfortable with the decision that you've made and the way that you've explained it, and want to give you an opportunity to test it and for them to test you, giving it in front of a team. So that process will carry on across the tournament. And at the end of the tournament, a group of New Zealand adjudicators called super adjudicators, those are people who've been on the AdCore of the 2 major NZUDC tournaments, Joint Scroll, and Easters will decide whether or not you've reached the standard where you can be a competitive member of the New Zealand judging pool. And this is quite a high standard. Often only 1 or 2 people accredit per tournament. Many people repeat the process. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but also it just dramatically improves your ability to judge. And sometimes if someone's just on the margin of being accredited or not, they'll invite them back to judge later debates, like the semi-final or the final. Once you become an accredited adjudicator, you can essentially judge at any of the major New Zealand tournaments. You can judge at Throppy, Clayton's, and the NZUDC tournaments like Joint and Easters, and then you can equally compete to break at those tournaments. You can apply to be on AdCores. So as I said, New Zealand runs a very formal style of accreditation. It's a style that makes you improve and holds you to quite a high standard. But many people who started out not being that involved in debating have gone along, have managed to become accredited by putting in hard work and by developing their judging skills. And there's also quite a few people, less in New Zealand than in other circuits, but definitely some in New Zealand, who've really made a name for themselves by being career adjudicators, by honing the craft of judging. So if you're less comfortable with the speaking element and the competitive speaking element of debating, you may find a home in judging, could still be a part of the community. You can still engage in something that you think is worthwhile, and you can still prove yourself by breaking and being appointed to AdCores in New Zealand and obviously in overseas. One of my beautiful flatmates, Joe, is on the AdCore for Australs. So even once you've CA'd both major New Zealand tournaments in the same year, there's still room for you to improve and develop and get better. There is one other way of accrediting. It's called accrediting via the break. So if you break at any 2 of the 4 majors, so if you break or twice at one of them, if you break at Australs, Joint Scroll, Easters, or now known as Officers Cup, or Worlds, if you break at any 2 of those, you become an accredited adjudicator. This is a very controversial process that there's a lot of discussion about getting rid of. And for people who never go through the trainee process and accredit via the break, there is to some degree a lack of support. So I think we're working as a circuit in making sure that those people can improve their judging skills so they can actually be better adjudicators, but also that people who are not ready to be adjudicators aren't given that privilege just because they happen to be good speakers. So an ongoing discussion within New Zealand debating, whether or not just being a good enough judge, good enough speaker means that you should be able to judge at later tournaments. So that's the process of how you become a judge. And if that's seeming very far away to you, don't worry at all. For most people, the first steps that they take towards becoming New Zealand accredited adjudicators is judging in the school circuit. So I know Auckland Schools Debating runs its own accreditation process for people who are wishing to become schools judges, and many other campuses also give you opportunities to judge at schools events and judge with good people who can give you feedback, and equally go along and trainee or judge your clubs nights, talk to your execs. Those are really the first real the first opportunity you have to start developing these skills or talking to people about what it means to be an effective adjudicator. So that's the process. What are we going to do in terms of figuring out what it means to be a good judge? So this is the part of the presentation where instead of just talking to you about process or who you should talk to get better, let's talk about what it means to be a good judge. Your role as a judge is to figure out which team has persuaded you more or less that their side of the motion is successful, or their side of the motion is more compelling. And what that seems very vague. What does it mean to persuade you one way or the other? So the way in which it's often taught in schools is we'll break down the way in which someone speaks into 3 things. You have the style with which they speak, the way in which they communicate ideas. You have the strategy, so how they prepare their points, what order they put them in, how they construct their case. And then you have the content. So what are they actually saying? How do the arguments stack up? At university, content is by far the most important thing that we judge people on. We are really assessing which argument is better than another argument, which has been made better, which contributes more to agreeing with them. So we exist very much in a sphere where we're trying to assess the arguments. That, of course, does not mean that strategy and style don't come into it, but they contribute in a way that's slightly different to actually assessing the ideas. So when you give an adjudication, what you're going to be doing is going through the different ideas within the debate, both explaining who is able to win each of the different clashes, each of the different points, but also explaining how those points or clashes fit into the overall decision that you've made in convincing you one way or the other. So that's very much leaning on the content side of what is being discussed. So what is the role, for example, of strategy? How do you judge strategy? Strategy will often contribute to the way in which speakers are able to make compelling arguments. So the order that they put things in will make the content more logical, easier to follow, more believable because of the way that they've structured the case. So obviously that comes in, and you'll explain to teams. The reason why I found this argument more compelling than this argument is because I think a very useful thing that was done by the teams was having all of these points leaning on the same fundamental premise. It was a good strategic move in explaining that idea. It helped me understand it. Therefore, it helps you win that particular clash. So strategy very much comes in there, but not something that's separately assessed. That's assessed in conjunction with content to examine how compelling or how persuasive it is. The same is true of style. Style is a way of communicating ideas, making it seem reasonable, believable, compelling, emotive, all of the things that make debating different to writing an essay, because it's a very human form of communication and arguing. So when you are assessing how style plays into the debate, you don't give a debate based on one team having better style than another team, but you are able to explain, for example, how the characterization of one side is more believable because of the way that they've wrapped persuasion and they've wrapped rhetoric around it. So that kind of stuff often I find doesn't feature hugely in the adjudication, and potentially should feature a little bit more. How have teams actually spent the work constructing these arguments, both from a strategic and a stylistic level? It's more discussed in that realm of ideas, but definitely give credit where it is due. When someone has, for example, two earlier speakers have given arguments that you're like, yeah, you understand, but you don't really see why they're important. And then another speaker has wrapped it in beautiful rhetoric and explained it with very realistic, compelling examples how that operates. That's something that deserves credit within the debate because it makes you feel like the arguments are stronger or more important. So all three of those things contribute to the overall idea of persuasiveness. And realistically, it's something all judges do a little bit differently. So no judge is going to be so there's very reasonable disagreements on how much you weigh style or how much certain strategic decisions weigh into those final clash points. But are things to be thinking about when you're making your adjudication overall. So if you are thinking about persuasiveness as just your general framework that you're going to be using, then what are you really supposed to do as an adjudicator? Because if you're just doing it on vibes for I think one team is persuaded more than others, often that can lead to slightly arbitrary decisions that don't make sense. If you have watched some of my earlier development seminars, you will hear me harping again and again and again on two concepts. And these are the two concepts that I think are very important for speakers to do at the very beginning of their prep times. These are things they need to start thinking about. And the reason why it's so important for speakers to start thinking about it is because I equally think it's important for adjudicators to be using these two concepts when they're coming to decisions. So what are these two concepts? The first is the comparative. You need to, as an adjudicator, be thinking very clearly that I am comparing two positions. I'm comparing two different sides of the motion, and I need to be specific about what the two different teams stand for. This is very important because often teams will try and argue against something that the opposition doesn't really stand for, the opposition doesn't really agree with, or it's not necessary for the opposition to agree with them to convince you of the motion. And then that team will claim that they've won the debate because they've been able to beat this other thing that doesn't actually weigh into your decision. So when you're thinking about setting up your idea of the debate, you need to be thinking, what are the two things I'm comparing? What are the two teams' positions? Be very specific on that. And if teams haven't made it easy for you to figure out what they're standing for, that's something that they've done wrong and will probably reflect badly on them when you're deciding how to give out scores. And we will have a discussion of how to do scoring a little bit later. So first thing to note, always thinking about the comparative. What are the two positions that we are comparing within the debate? What are the specifics of those positions? Have teams been arguing against other things that aren't relevant to how you should come to that decision within the debate? And note, the comparative always needs to be linked into the words of the motion. What does the motion say? What is a reasonable interpretation from both sides about what they need to stand for in the spirit of that motion? So if you think about comparative, The second thing you think about, and equally you do this as a speaker, is you think about the framework of the debate. And what you do there is both teams will be offering you visions of what it means for them to win the debate. If I, adjudicator, convince you of this, this, and this, we think that that is enough to win us the debate, is enough to persuade you that our side of the motion is the correct side of the motion. I think teams should be doing this much more explicitly, explaining their win conditions, explaining what makes them compelling. And if you watch the semifinal and final of Cinnamon Scroll, and you watch the third affirming speaker of the final, Ben Jackson, he always starts his speech with a very, very explicit, here's what the opposition needs to do to win. Here's how they are unable to win. So he makes it extremely clear what the framework you should adopt in the debate is. And it's very hard to give debates against him if he's able to convince you that the way to judge the debate is in line with what his team has already proven. But oftentimes we hear adjudications because where adjudicators will be like, I think there were 3 points of clash. Point 1, point 2, point 3. I think one team won 2 of those, the other team won 1 of those. Therefore, the team that won 2 of them won. That's not at all how you should be adjudicating. You shouldn't be adjudicating by like mathematically by saying, oh, I think this team has 1 more points, therefore they win. You need to be thinking about what's important to persuade me? What is the impact of these points? How do I weigh these things against each other? All of that stuff that comes into a framework of how you judge the debate that all teams should be doing collectively. So if you're thinking about those 2 things, if you're thinking about the style, strategy, and content that's built into persuasiveness, those are the basics that you need to be an effective adjudicator. Let me just have a check if there are any questions at this stage. So none through the anonymous form. And any on the and no comments through the thing. Okay, so we'll just drive ever forward. So here's some more high-level stuff to be thinking about when you are judging. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is something a little bit built into the culture of judging and the culture of debating, and that's what happens when you're trying to decide how you should judge what you think is persuasive relative to what you know other people think is persuasive. Because let's be honest, you are an individual who is judging a debate. You have your own biases, you have your own ways of thinking, you've got your own temptations to insert yourself into the debate. And note, debating is all about assumptions. It's all about assertions. It's very, very difficult to prove objective truth within a debate. So it's always arguing, like it's very difficult to separate what an adjudicator knows and what an adjudicator should know, or what the average adjudicator knows. And the way that we tend to think about how that works in knowledge is we talk about the lay adjudicator, or the average reasonable voter, or the reasonable global voter. There's like 50, 100 words that we use to describe it, but essentially what it means is the average person who happens to be really smart and able to follow these very compelling arguments. So someone who has normal knowledge but and follows like current events, but happens to be way smarter than other things. So when you are thinking about how not to insert yourself into the debate, you need to distance yourself from the arguments a little bit. So you'll always do like a plausibility check. Do I understand this argument? Do I think this argument is compelling? And at some point that's all you can do. You can only be in your head. You can't be the average reasonable voter. But then you apply a little bit of a check and be like, is the reason why I am thinking this thing about this point because of information that I have, or knowledge that I have, or arguments that I would make, or is it something that has been offered by the other team or the average reasonable person would find implausible? And often this will lead to clashes where you will think one thing, you'll be like, oh, this point is dumb, but you'll think the average reasonable person will believe it enough that if it's left on the table by the opposition and not pushed back against, can still stand within the debate and win. And it is a very difficult, fine balance to draw whether an argument is robust enough to stand without being rebutted, or whether it's so implausible that it shouldn't be given credit within the debate. But it's one you will slowly start to come to terms with as you become an adjudicator. And note, this is a very interesting area with the New Zealand, where different circuits have very different approaches. So some circuits are incredibly credulous. They'll be like, yep, even if I think this is the dumbest argument in the world, it'll stand unless it's rebutted. And even if it's rebutted a tiny bit, then the argument is gone. And then some, and I think New Zealand probably falls more into this argument, where judges tend to be a little bit more activist about what they think are bad arguments and just be like, no, I think that argument is dumb. Even if it's not particularly well dealt with, I don't think it passes my plausibility test, so I want to assess the best arguments. So different circuits will be doing this to different degrees, and to some degree you need to shift your adjudicating style if you go to somewhere like Australs or Worlds than if you are just judging at a New Zealand tournament with that level of robustness you assess things towards. The second thing to say is that when you are adjudicating, there's a balance that you need to make between doing what you think is correct that a judge should do and doing something that you think you know all of the other judges are doing. And I like to characterize this as a consistency within the judging pool versus individually what you think is the correct thing to do when assessing particular arguments or scoring in a particular way. I think two things you need to keep in mind when trying to decide whether you should go with what you think is the correct way to judge or what you know everyone else in the circuit is going to do, is that it needs to be a balancing impact, a balancing act. Because on one side, you want to try and drive evolution within the circuit. And if everyone who had different ways of doing things had been entirely silent about how they did them, we probably would have a worse style of judging. There wouldn't be as much innovation. There wouldn't be as much challenging of ideas. But here's something that definitely needs to be taken into account. You need to judge in a way that's consistent with the rest of the judging pool, because A, sometimes you're wrong, and delegating to the wisdom of the crowd is sometimes a correct thing to do. But secondly, we need to make sure that people are being judged in the same way across a circuit so that they can get better, so that they can think about things. And so particular arguments that often happens is about people who give very low scores or very high scores because they think that on average debating is better or debating is worse than everyone else in those circuits. I think people need to be very careful about how they use their own judgment of, I think that X thing is the way to go in debating, because it means that teams can be treated unfairly, or that getting you as a judge can have a dramatic impact on their tournament. And as a judge, you need to have, to some degree, some humility in saying that what I'm doing is I'm performing a role for my community. This is not just about what I think, but is about making sure that people are judged fairly and effectively within the broader corpus of the other judges, and then judging along those standards. So when you are becoming quite an advanced judge and you start thinking about, like, I don't like the way that New Zealand judges as a whole engage with things, that's the moment where you need to have more of a conversation with people, try and convince people to your way of thinking about particular ideas or judging particular ideas. But you also need to have that humility, make sure that you are judging in a consistent way, because it's unfair to teams if every single judge has given them feedback to act one way and it's the accepted way to do things in New Zealand debating. And then they do that thing, they follow that advice, and you punish them for it. So needs to be, to some degree, a balancing act. So before we jump into the specifics of doing a screen share and showing exactly how I would be setting up my notes, I just have three more bits of general feedback. The first is to look at how to give an oral adjudication. Oral adjudications, I think, are a very unique skill because you have to be able to accurately describe what's happening in the debate, but you need to do it in a way that's efficient, that makes the arguments and clashes clear to all of the speakers. So when I'm setting up my oral adjudication, here are some of the things that I'm thinking about. So I've gone through all of the different arguments that the different speakers have given, and I think about which of the arguments have weight in the debate, which of the arguments fit into the framework that I've been convinced that I should judge the debate in, and then I take those arguments and I put them into like the bulk of my adjudication. That's normally what I'm going to be discussing. So with those arguments, the point is not to describe word for word what the teams have said or how the arguments have developed, because you're not remaking the arguments, you're just testing the strength of one argument against each other. So where, for example, you've had a particular turning point within the argument, you'll want to highlight it. I was convinced by this point until this analysis that came out at this speaker. So being specific about what has had impact rather than just going through all of those arguments again, because if you're going through all of those arguments again, it's very inefficient, it's very boring for the teams to listen to. It doesn't make it clear to the teams what has happened. So within that broad mass of the points that have been impactful to the debate, you go through each of them, you explain which way swung you, which way or the other, you explain why you give them impact or weighing, and at the beginning and the end of your adjudication, you'll give people a framework. What I needed to be convinced within this debate is on my 3 points of clash, this thing, and this thing, or this thing and this thing weighed in one way and this thing weighed in the other way, but I concluded this way because on balance, I thought it was more important for this reason, this reason, this reason. You want to, at both the beginning and the end, give people an overview of how you made the decision so that when they're thinking about the debate, they can very clearly figure out why you have decided the way that you have and what small bits of analysis were able to tweak you one way or the other. So if you've separated, remember at the beginning, the arguments that do have weight and that you think were impactful in the debate, and you do that with them, you also need to think about the arguments that didn't have weight, that weren't impactful. So if they related to one of those major issues, but they just didn't convince you, you're going to want to include them in the bulk of your adjudication and just say, this didn't convince me for this reason. Because note, teams are very attached to the arguments that they give. And while you don't want to go through the minutiae of every argument, if they've spent 5 minutes talking about something across their 4 speeches, you want to be very specific about why that didn't come into your adjudication, explain how that argument could be better, how it could work in the future, so they feel like they've been heard, they feel like you haven't just ignored their arguments. Then you'll have some stuff that is just like throwaway arguments. Often it's second splits because we convince people to have a second split point, even if they're not thinking about how it could possibly weigh into the framework of a debate. You just need to, at the beginning of adjudication, tag that you've heard this point, you've understood it, but same thing, it doesn't weigh into your decision for those reasons. So, brief overview. If I'm going through my adjudication, first thing I say is, here are the arguments that didn't factor into my decision. Very quickly overview about why they fell out, because it didn't deal with a comparative, because I thought it was symmetrical, blah, 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 blah. Then I'll say, here is how I came to my decision. In the end, I was convinced of these 2 things on the one side and this thing on the other side, but I thought that this was more important for these reasons. Or I thought that 2 teams were offering different versions of the world that could go this way, could go this way. I was convinced that I was going to go this way because of this overarching contextual point or this bit of analysis that I thought was compelling. So you're giving them the overview, the takeaway of how you've made that decision. Then you go through specifically, here's clash 1, here's clash 2, here's clash 3, the things that were in that overview, explaining how each of them fell the way that they did or why they felt that they did, and then just a very brief recap. So to conclude, because I thought that this point was won, these 2 points was won by this team, this point was won by the other team, but these 2 points were more important for these reasons, I think that the debate went to this team. So if you use that sandwich structure, very clear to the teams what has happened, it forces you to be a bit more efficient. And remember, make sure you're not just repeating the arguments or re-explaining the arguments. They know what the arguments were. They need you to explain why they were relevant, why they were well made, whether they were good or not. Okay, that shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes. I have struggled with that enormously over my career, getting down the time, because there's a huge temptation, especially when you're like, oh, I want to show off, to go through all the little arguments and explain how each one went in each little direction. But that's not what teams are looking for as a judge. You need to give them a holistic views, and you need to give them reasons for your decisions rather than descriptions of the debate. So that's what happens in your oral adjudication. Second thing I'm going to talk about is feedback. And if you've listened to Noise on the Bench, you'll know that my flatmate's perspective is very clear. We need to be giving less feedback to teams because teams can't internalize all of that information. Different speakers will want different things, so I take a little bit more of a laissez-faire approach. If you're dealing with people who are young, or people who ask for, or people who you think there's one thing that they should particularly focus on, give them one piece of feedback and tell them to improve on that thing. If you give people huge amounts of feedback, many people aren't able to think about all of those things. They aren't able to bring them into their debating. So you want to make them feel like they've been heard and seen and listened to, and that you understand their weaknesses and you think that they can do this important thing a bit better. They can then take it away and do better. Some speakers want a little bit more of a discussion, either about the case or about all the different things because they like to keep a collection of them and look for themes or like whatever. You can give them a little bit more feedback, but if that needs to be inspired by them. They need to be like, hey, I want all of the feedback. I want every single thing. And actually, as a speaker who's often wanted all of the things and wanted just to know everything about my speech and how well and how poorly, it's actually sometimes not particularly helpful unless you have good follow-up strategies across, for example, a tournament, being like, hey, this little bit of feedback has come up 3 different times. It's something that I need to focus on a bit more rather than being a one-off for that little debate. So feedback, make sure it's very clean, concise, describes the problem, but also describes the solution. So you're wanting to balance those two things. And lastly, just like note that even if you are a very new adjudicator giving feedback to a very experienced debater, if they have done something that you haven't understood, they need to get better on that particular thing. Because whether those good debaters like it or not, they're often going to have to win or lose tournaments, win or lose important debates based on convincing people who maybe aren't as experienced as them. So they need to bring down their level of debating to a world where it can be understood by everyone within debating, or they're going to lose and they should lose. So don't be afraid to tell them, hey, I didn't understand this point. Hey, your signposting needed to be a bit clearer. Hey, I thought your timing was weird. You didn't spend enough talking about this thing, because they'll actually really appreciate it because often they don't get that kind of feedback. Okay, last little bit of general theory. I understand that you've received a lot of it, is talking about how you do scoring. Don't worry that much about scoring, is the first thing that I'd say. It's something that you need to be good at, but it's something that doesn't need to be freaked out about. The way in which I personally score is I go through and I figure out the relative rankings of the speaker. Like I thought that this was the best speaker in the debate. I thought this was the worst speaker. I thought they were better than the next big speaker by this much. So figuring out whether I think it's a 1 point jump or a half a point jump or a 2 points jump or even like a 10-point jump if it's like a really wild debate. And then after that, you start thinking about how good the debate is. And there's like a constant process that happens that being like, okay, I've given these scores, but no, then that doesn't make sense. So I'll move that up a little bit. So don't be wedded to scores. I think the worst scoring styles that I see is someone will go through and be like, first, I think the first speaker was a this, and then think, oh, I think the second speaker was a this, and just like pulling the ideas just from the top of their head. No, you need to be engaging with the debate, comparing the different speakers, thinking about how good the overall debate is, cross-checking it against other things, because remember, the point of speaks is to try and be consistent with what everyone else has done, or the way that every other judge would do them. And obviously this is impossible, but adjudicators who are not in line with that general consensus or who don't put in that relative thinking end up producing results that are anomalous. They don't reflect how good the actual speakers are. And that's unfair to the speakers, both because sometimes speakers won't break because of that or break in a worse position, but also because at the end of the end of the day, debating is a very competitive activity. People have very strong opinions, their self-esteem is very much bound up in this kind of thing. And so you want to be doing the best that you can to deliver them what they've come for. Okay, question, particularly pertaining to BP, but interested to hear others. Vikas, could you elaborate as in how do you judge POIs? And we will do a specific both BP and a specific judging BP tutorials later in the year when we start getting into BP. So I'll just start answering Vikas's question. So he asked, how do you weigh POIs into speaker positions? So if someone has offered a brilliant POI, very happy for them to be rewarded for that. It shows their engagement in the debate if it's a style that has POIs. And so offering very good POIs is a reason to rate someone or to give them a better speech. How do you rate that into your overall decision? So the first thing to note is often offering POIs just demonstrates engagement with ideas and shows that the speaker has been engaged in general. So it should impact the way that you see that speaker and should impact the way you see their case as being responsive to the other case. What I would note, though, is that the way you judge POIs doesn't necessarily need to be different to the way you judge anything else within a debate. It'll normally raise an important question that'll demand an answer from the opposition. And if they're unable to answer that question in a satisfactory way, it'll likely show underlying weaknesses within those arguments. And so don't necessarily consider them different. If it's just a POI and isn't developed by later speakers, you just treat it like that. Hey, this raised questions was never developed completely fully, didn't go far enough to defeat this point, but helped reduce some of the impact. So don't think about it as too different to any other point. So Vikas has just been a little bit more specific. Here are some other questions. Firstly, to what extent do you weight style in speaker scores? So the way that you weight style in speaker scores is exactly the way that you weight style in terms of who wins the debate. style is very useful for if it helps convince you of certain facts within the debate. So say it helps you attach particular importance to a particular point, or it helps it, or it amazes you and makes you feel like that the point is very clear and like well developed and well understood, then all of those stylistic aspects will play into how good you see that speaker as being. So style will to some degree have a good impact. Note, if a speaker says nothing for 8 minutes in a beautiful style, they probably haven't persuaded you of anything, so you can't reward them on that fact. So style can't be judged separately to the way, it can't be judged as like a separate component. I think that they had good style, therefore I'm going to add 2 or 3 points. Always needs to be linked back to what have those ideas contributed. And if you can just elaborate here a little bit more on why I think style is important. It links back to what I was saying earlier about debating often resting on assertions or assumptions, and a judge being a bit unsure which assertions or which assumptions to trust. Trust is the operative word. When you are a judge, you will have 2 teams offering different visions of the world, and you will have to decide which one you believe. The one you believe will often be the one that's fleshed out in a more clear way, like so you can understand all the different aspects, so a clear style will help there. You could be convinced by it feeling particularly reasonable, which means you'll trust that team more, that team hasn't lied to you, that team has engaged with the reality of the world, therefore you think that's more plausible, more persuasive, or that speaker has convinced you in a way that's really emotionally compelling, that's made you want to trust them, that's made the harms feel particularly big as a human being reacting to it. So style can link into all of those different things there and should be reflected in people's speaker scores to the degree that has helped you convince them one way or the other. That was a very good question. Do you think speakers who don't take POIs should be penalized, assuming the other team is offering lots? I think delegate to the style here. Some styles have slightly more strict rules about this, so you should go back and check. So for example, you're doing BP. BP has quite a strong penalty on not taking POIs, so you really need to take POIs off, or judges are going to be really quite like harsh on you. I think it's potentially a little bit different for something like a 3v3 style where you've got so much time left to engage with the debate. So like, the point that you make in your POI is just way less important than it would be in a BP style. And often the offering and not accepting POIs in specifically a BP sense, and sorry if you aren't really sure about BP, BP is where you have 4 teams competing against each other. Offering or accepting POIs will frame a lot into how judges assess engagement. And engagement is quite important because obviously your opening speakers can't respond to the ideas that come out at closing. So if a closing team is locking out an opening team and not allowing them to give POIs, that can only reflect badly on the closing team because it doesn't give the opening team a chance to engage or a chance to respond. So your bias then should be to thinking a little bit more favorably of your opening teams there. So that's how that operates. How do you distinguish whether whether the things Third and Eggs are saying are new or not? I think this is a very good question. I think this is something that we should discuss way more as a circuit, and also applies to BP when we're talking about the ways. The way in which I think about the newness of material, I disagree with the idea that it should be the difference between responses and substantive material. And you will probably have heard me say this before, that I actually don't think there's a big difference between responsive material and substantive material. Both of them are about convincing you to go along with a new world, and just phrasing like a huge new substantive thing as a response to the ideas that have been brought forward by the opposition doesn't make that material not new just because it's been made in a responsive way. The way in which I judge a third speaker or whip speaker's newness within the debate is whether or not it fits into the existing clashes of the debate. So say if it contributes to a particular idea, even if it's in a slightly new mechanistic way, but is responding to those ideas that are already within the debate or engaging with the ideas that are already within the debate, I consider that material as less new than material that tries to open avenues in the debate or win the debate on other areas. And note, I think Australia judges this a little bit differently. I think Australia is way more comfortable with thirds trying to drag the debate in different directions, which is why they produce very good third speakers, but also change the way that judging operates a little bit. The second thing I think about is whether or not it is stuff that could reasonably have been intuited from the case from the opposition, before it had been brought into the debate. And that to some degree echoes what I've already been talking about. If the argument is all about the legalization of drugs and someone has brought a point about stigmatization of drugs, and then the third speaker brings out like a bunch of compelling examples, all leading to like brings the point in its best version, because it's linked into what has already been done, because it's very expectable, because it's something that you know from the case that's been developed from first is something that the third speaker is going to be talking about. I tend to think that as less new, and I give it greater weight, as opposed to something that couldn't have been expected, like mechanisms that are brand new from different directions that hadn't featured at all within the debate as being brought in. The last thing I'll say on this topic is it's not at all a binary. It's about how much weight you give it to. Because some arguments, and the newness of those arguments are on a continuum. So if it's in the middle between being slightly too new and slightly not too new, you're going to give it credit based on how much you think it was present within the case before, or those ideas were present. Because what we want to do is we want to disincentivize third speakers taking advantage of it, or using it in a way that gives them an advantage over the opposition, because they don't have much time to respond to it. We want to make sure that debaters bring ideas early, they're not hiding ideas and then bringing out a third and hoping no one responds to it. So the degree to which it is new is the degree to which you take weight out of it at the point. And often I'll tell a speaker, hey, this contributed to my adjudication. I thought it was really good material. I thought it was to some degree reflected in stuff that has come earlier. But because it diverged in this way, and this way, in ways that were too new, I couldn't give it the full weight that would have had if it had come out earlier. So make sure you're bringing out those points a little bit earlier. Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I think that'll be really, really useful for people who are watching judging, and also very useful for the speakers themselves who are thinking about whether to offer POIs or how they act as third speakers. Okay, a question from James. If one team has a much better understanding of the world, general knowledge, do you give them more points or weight within the debate? Not necessarily. A team that shows off about their knowledge or gives you a really clear characterization of how like Sudanese government works in terms of how important their flag is, will not just automatically win the debate because they know more. If they are able to show the fact that they know more and it gives weight to the points that they're making and the framework of your debate, then yes, of course. If someone is able to explain in way more detail how things operate in a way more clear, compelling way, that is something that will be giving weight to within the debate. But it's not a comparison of content knowledge. Often teams that know less are able to win because they use that material more effectively. That's in the realm of stuff that's just generally known. So say, for example, the debate is about economics and one team knows more about economics, and most people would broadly understand that these concepts exist. They're just able to explain it way better because they know more. That's just uncontroversially something that is useful to their team. There's a concept called spec knowledge, or specific knowledge, that's often thrown around in other circuits and less so in New Zealand, which I think is just quite thankful in that we don't tend to be highly specky debaters, just being like, well, actually, your point is not true for this highly specific technical reason about how like the law operates. But obviously, it does happen. This is where the judge needs to be thinking about, once again, your average reasonable voter or your average well-informed person, and thinking about how relevant that argument would be to your average person. So if it's an argument that's just far beyond what anyone else knows, say it's your master's thesis on rat hearts, like Grace's, it's the example that Grace likes to use because she did her honors thesis on something about like rat hearts and protein. That's not something that would get much credit within the debate because we can't assess whether it is true or not. So it's not particularly helpful to introduce that degree of specific knowledge in the way that the debate operates. So say, for example, the debate is about the Malaysian prime minister, and you're like, well, actually, I know that the cabinet official that they want to appoint is this thing because of my family's connection to that. That's not something we give weight to in the debate because it's unable to be assessed. But note here, I think this gets to something very fundamental about debating. Debating is about people bringing different claims that are difficult to assess and then trying to convince you that their assertions are better than the other team's assertions. So all of this is to some degree up in the air. And that's where things like style and strategy and reasonableness come in. How you present those ideas, how you buy the trust of the adjudicator, how you push the idea that you should believe me, even though you can't tell whether one argument is necessarily more true than the other. And I think the way you justify that is the same as you justify in any normal argument. You'll be like, we know this thing is true because we know that this other thing that is generally accepted is true, and they have parallels. We know this thing is true because I'm going to give you some good details that make it clear that I'm not just making this up, that I'm building like a very clear, compelling world, or because, hey, I've been reasonable about these other examples, therefore you should trust me in bringing this other example because our case generally fits into a world that you could see existing. So this is probably one of the most interesting parts of debating, trying to convince another team, that an adjudicator, that your world is the one they should go for, rather than a equally plausible world from the opposition, just because of the craft that you bring us debating. So very interesting, something that you only really get, well, everyone is to some degree good at it. It's a very like normal human being thing, trying to be persuasive. But it's something you start appreciating more the older you become, the more you start losing debates against teams making wild claims and accusations about how we should weigh these types of knowledge. No one clear answer, just a very fascinating ongoing debate that's happening within the debating world. Cool. Any other questions in the comments? Apologies if I'm not seeing all of them. I think I am, but that was a very helpful question. Let me just check the forum one more time. Cool. So I'll come back to the forum at the end, but what I'm going to do for you now is I'm going to do a just clear view of how I do our notes. And I'm going to screen share my white blank document. Here we go. Okay, so you should all be able to see a blank white document. So I have come around more to the idea of judging on my computer. When I'm in person or not doing online tournaments, I often judge with paper, and I do it in a slightly different way. But what I'm going to do now is to show you how I judge when I'm using my computer, and I'll explain how it's different when I judge when it's on paper. So I like to go insert table, and then there's 4 speeches from each team. I'm doing this as an Austral style debate, so I'll make 4, and then I'll make that big, but not that big. I'll just make it fill up the page. And then I'll go down a little bit. Ah, that's gone down too far. That shouldn't have been 5. There we go. And I'll insert another. And this one's going to be 5, because what that's going to be, those are going to be my speaks. That's something I'm going to be thinking about. And you've got the speaks for each of the speeches, and then you've got your totals. And that just means it's very easy for when you're sending this to the tab director, who was me at Cinnamon Scroll, very annoyingly messaging people, hey, I need to check that your ballot's correct. You haven't entered it falsely online. So that allows you to do it separately. And I always only deal with this once I've come to my decision. Speaks is the last thing I do, because you're not judging mathematically. You should never give the debate on who has more speaks. You should always give more speaks based on who has won the debate. So what I'll do is I'll write the introduction, and then as they're giving their split, say this is about the legalization of drugs, and they talk 1, they're going to talk about war on drugs, and then they're going to talk about treatment. As they're saying their split, I'm going to go through those particular things. So how does the more specific stuff that I do operate? So obviously, to some degree, I'm taking notes. Do not write word for word what speakers are saying. What you need to do is to do a little bit more of that synthesization and explaining why the different arguments are having an impact, or why you think arguments are important within the debate while you are judging it. Sometimes, especially when judges move to their computers, they just say every single thing that the debater argues. What you're going to want to do is go through the subpoints, so that each area, so say subpoint is like gun violence, is so when you are thinking back, you have a clear idea of everything that is going to be done. You're going to explain just like the link so that you understand it. And then often you'll put something to show how good you thought it was. So I could say, wow, they made that argument great. I'm going to write good. I tend to use red for all of my feedback. So I'll write good example question mark. They didn't give an example. So I'll just have that in the back of my mind when I'm assessing it. I'll just go through the different speakers as they go through. Hopefully, the different points that the teams will be bringing will be their contribution to the debate. When I'm judging on paper, what I'll tend to do is I'll tend to have another like grid that I have like this. And within that grid, at the end of each person's speech, I'll write what they contributed to the debate. So say the first speaker of the affirming team on a debate about the legalization of drugs has contributed these two things. They've explained to me how the war on drug operates, and they explained to me how treatment operates. I'll write just in their like little box, I'll write war on drugs and I'll write treatment, just so that I can, at the end of the debate, look over a condensed version of the debate to see that I've caught all of the big ideas that people are talking about. And then if I need specifics, I can come back to my notes. I don't really do that online because you're way more flexible in how you're able to construct your adjudication or construct your notes. So I'll have my two speakers. They'll have given all of their points. And then in the section after the debate, I'll start to think about the framework of the debate. So one team will have explained to me why they think there's two groups that are affected. One group is so victims of wars on drugs. And then two is addicts. How do we help those two groups of people? Because their framework within the debate is we're going to talk to you about two groups of people, this group and this group. If we're able to convince you of either of these groups are going to be better off from this debate, we think we deserve to win for these reasons. And say the other team has brought a principled point about drugs being bad. And I'll be like, okay, that might be something that's part of my framework. So I'll instead here and I'll go principle. Drugs are bad. And then as the debate develops, I'll be putting just the headlines, because remember, I'm not doing most of my writing in this part of the screen. I'll do the headlines or the good bits of analysis after each speeches will fill into this thing. So say there was a really good argument about individuals being coerced into working for criminal gangs, killed by government. Say there was an amazing point on that. I'll include that, and then underneath it, I'll have the responses. And then hopefully by the end of the debate, this section will just essentially become my adjudication. And I'll do my pruning. After each speech, I'll be taking things out, I'll be putting things in, I'll saying this thing that responded to this thing, always keeping in my mind that this shouldn't be too long, it shouldn't be too confused or too detailed, otherwise I'll lose the teams. And just go through your adjudication at the end of each speaker, just making their contributions to the debate quite clear. I tend to write very little for my leaders' replies. I'll tend to just actually have the 3 points I talk about because I think it's very interesting, the overall decisions that they make in terms of what they're prioritizing in their leaders' reply, and that'll affect the way that I then think about these issues. And often this will change dramatically. So say the debate shifts hugely, and someone proves to me that addicts and victims of war are actually the same victims of the same thing, and so it becomes like this bigger point, and these become A and B. So you need to keep that flexibility. You need to not be caught in the world of what's happening first. You need to be evolving. But it's good to be able to be keeping up during the debate, explaining how things have developed. Obviously, then you'll have your adjudication. You'll fill in your scores. You'll be thinking about, okay, what's the margin? So maybe I'll put like +1 over this person, and I'll use them as my baseline. I'll do, this one was slightly worse. This one was way better. Just like amazing speech. And then obviously going down, and then I'll think like, okay, how good the debate was. So I'll be like, okay, I thought that speech, my 0 speech was maybe like a 71. And then I'll go, okay, so that makes that a 72. That makes that a 79. That makes that a, oh, sorry, not 99. That makes that a 70. Then I'll plausibility check it again, being like, okay, do those scores really make sense? Maybe I was way too generous to this person, need to bring them down to like a 77 or 78. And so that's how you'll then construct it. Last thing that you'll do, so now you've got your adjudication, you're making sure that it's succinct. You do 2 things. Firstly, sometimes it's good to have general feedback, especially when you're talking to high school students, because they might have missed the debate. You'll explain like, this thing was really missing, and very often it'll be like, but no one really engaged with the comparative. I wasn't clear what was being argued here. No one really gave me a strong framework. It was difficult for me to figure out what to value within this debate. And these foundational issues probably will have an effect on this later stuff that happens. So you'll want to be very clear about how you decided them. So what X said, what Neg said, what I thought. Yeah, and then how that fit into the framework. And you'll want to give them that very clear overview. Because I accepted this comparative, that we're not going to be legalizing all drugs, or sorry, we're going to be regulating all drugs. We aren't going to be legalizing and not regulating them. I thought that had a big effect on this point and this point. And because they're able to convince me of those points, they won the debate. So you're going to want that general feedback, or something. It can be, sometimes it can be something like, there was no POIs, ask more POIs. So you give your general bit of feedback, always announce who won before you get into your adjudication. And then I'll say, okay, so 2 things to sort out before the adjudication. The comparative was unclear, the framework was unclear, here's how I made my decisions. What didn't come up? So I'll just then list each of the things that what wasn't important, not what didn't come up, what wasn't important. So I'll just be like, I didn't think that the point about the local economy was particularly effective because there was only 2 minutes at second speaker and that was never mentioned again. Wasn't able to factor into my decision. So just make sure that the speakers know that they're heard, very quick discussions, then going through your adjudication. Last thing is, if you're giving your feedback in red, it becomes very, very easy to give feedback at the end of the debate, because you'll be like, first affirming speaker, I really liked this analysis. So start with a compliment. What did you like? What I think you can do better next time is make sure that your analysis that is very good in the abstract is tied to specific examples, because if you tie them to specific examples, that helps you stylistically, it helps me believe you, it makes your examples more clear. It makes your analysis more clear. It's not just all from the ether. Please make sure that for each point, you are walking me through the story with a clear example. And that's all the feedback you'd give to that person, and that would be it. Neat. This has been a lot of chatting. Any last questions for how to judge? This has obviously been a very quick, but hopefully thorough overview for those of you who are getting into being an adjudicator. I'll just wait 5 minutes. Just drink my tea and eat my brownie. I'm going to stop sharing now. It has turned out to be a beautiful evening. I like adjudicating. I think it makes you, adjudicating makes you think about debating as a thing rather than just like winning. And often the most interesting discussions you have is like, oh, I love that final, that Australs final that we just watched. How do you think that this point should have been judged? Do you think that the decision was right? I can't believe that it was a 5-4 split. What do you think they disagreed about? And then you'll have really interesting discussions about what it means to be a good debater, what it means to be stylistically effective, how much we should weigh principled analysis about what we should value. Yeah, judging is very good. Oh, I can smell everyone making dinner. It's pretty great. Okay, I've finished my tea. My brownie is yet to be finished, and I might eat it off screen to avoid making everyone enormously jealous. But thank you. I think this was a good session, and huge thank you to those who submitted questions. If you want any follow-up, flick me a message. Very happy to chat about these things. I'll see you later.